And so I'm going to tell the first story of the day today, because this is actually much harder to do, and it's easier said than done. And it's hard to get called out. And so I will share a story about my children. I have adult children who call me out, and it is tough to hear. We were sitting around, and I was talking about how I wanted to remodel my bathroom. And I told them, you know, the first thing I want to do is I want to replace that low flush toilet, and I want to get a real state-of-the-art toilet, one that can handle
totally need to use the mic because it's being recorded. So again, I'm Arthur Pope. I am currently in my first year at Penn, a new faculty member there. So, but before we get started, I just wanted to take a gauge of in the room. Can we raise hands of who residency program directors? Okay. And then are there any residents in the room? Okay. Yeah. And then other staff, faculty. Okay. All right. Sounds good. So I, was fortunate enough to train at University of Chicago. So Sandra was my intern, and now she's about to be the third year. It was a very diverse environment. And so even within that program, we created our own sort of group with the underrepresented residents. So we would have get-togethers. We would have off-site mentoring sessions where we would talk about career opportunities. And so when I came to Penn, our vice chair for diversity, Gina South, asked me to start a mentorship program for the residents at Penn. So prior to about 3 years ago, Penn had maybe, I think, 4% of their residents represented URM. And so the current second year class was the first where they brought in 5 Black residents at the time. The current first year class, they have 2 Black residents and 1 Latinx resident. And this incoming class has 9 underrepresented residents out of the 14 coming in. So that's been a huge change in the Penn system. So what I created was so this all kind of started in July when I got there. And I sort of brainstormed if I were a resident in a program, what would I have wanted to feel supported as an underrepresented resident? So I kind of had 3 components to it. There was a social component, of course. There is a professional development component, and then there's also a mentorship component to it as well, and then community. So this year I was able to accomplish 2 out of the 3 things. Omicron kind of threw a curveball into a lot of this. So our very first meeting happened in October, and at that meeting we kind of discussed what are your career goals as a resident? What are you interested in? We kind of did a check-in with them. This was October, so the interns have been there for a few months. The second years are now starting, and that was a way for us to gauge: are there any problems going on that we need to address with leadership? As people who have some power, we can then take this back to leadership and say, these are the things our residents are experiencing. These are the things that you can fix and make better for them. So that was our first meeting. Our second meeting didn't take place until February, so that's the photo that's on the left here. And then that meeting, and also in between time, they are paired up with other URM faculty. So at Penn, we actually have about, I think as of next year, there'll be 10 of us. And I know that's not possible at every institution, so we are, again, very grateful that that is something that we have. So they're paired with each URM faculty, and in between each meeting that we have, they are to meet with them. So they can go out to lunch. We pay for this. We say, here's $20, go out, chat, do whatever. And they select who they want their mentor to be. So then in the February meeting, we discussed sort of the professional development talk we talked about then was transition. So now the second years are getting ready to transfer into being third years and running the room, and the first years are now getting up to the point where they need to start carrying more patients. So we talked about, what it's like to transition, thinking about, the constant challenge of us chasing perfectionism and how that's not possible, right? Even as an attending, I'm still learning a lot. And so we all kind of shared our stories during that time. And each one of these sessions has a social aspect. So this is at my house in Philadelphia, and so we have dinner during that time. And then at the second session, we also went around and talked about wins that we were having. So, each resident said, hey, I just became a part of this fellowship, or the faculty shared I got this big grant. And so that was a way for us to all share in our success. And then the last big event we had just happened in April. Let me go back. Okay. We had a retreat. So this was a big goal of mine, is to have a safe space for these residents to have a day to themselves to talk about any issues. So the first thing that we had a little yoga session in the very beginning for 30 minutes, which was great. And then we did some career visioning. So Gina has been in a coaching program, and so she kind of went through the residents and said, what is your vision statement, right? Thinking about what your long-term career goals are, because then that kind of takes you back to why you're doing what you're doing. We get so caught up and being emergency medicine doctors and getting burnt out. But if you kind of take that, peel it back, think about why you're doing what you're doing and how does that align with your vision, I think that, refocuses you on your career. And then the third session that we actually had a campus psychologist come, and she kind of just had an open-ended question, and this allowed the residents and faculty to share stories about like what they had been going through. And I think that was one of the most powerful sessions that we had, because it really, people really opened up and were telling everybody, like, we are here for you, we care about you. And so this is something we're actually gonna incorporate, try to have her come like every 6 months to check in with the group to see what's going on. And then we had another afternoon career visiting session, and then we ended with a talk from a cardiothoracic surgeon who knows a lot about personal finance. So we kind of ended it on like, these are the tools that you need to be like successful financially. So that's kind of what I've created, thus far at Penn. Next year our goal is to have 5 contacts. The residents want to have 2 retreats, but we're like, we don't think we could do that. Maybe we could have like a winter check-in and then like a bigger spring retreat. But I think the most important thing for this is that you have to have buy-in from your department and your leadership. So our chair, this is like really important to him. Not only that, but he also gives money, which is really important. So I had a $10,000 budget to be able to do this year, right? So you really need money in order to be able to do this, and I'm very grateful that we have been able to do that. So I just wanted to share a success that we're having. So thanks. So next up is Dr. Buckford.
Hi, good morning, everyone. I'm Tanisha Beckford. I am actually one of the other residents in the room this morning, representing Boston Medical Center. And I'm here presenting with one of my colleagues, Ryan. So today we're going to be basically going over the relevant literature and doing a very short literature review. As you can imagine, there is not much literature out there, especially when it comes to DEI work. But after going through the things that we were able to find, we were able to come up with some key points and concepts. So today we're going to be talking about those concepts. And we decided to make a QR code for you guys. So that way you can follow along with the literature that we are going to review today. And then we added some key gems. So there is a glossary that goes over shared terminology so that we are all starting from the same point. We can talk about very common terms, relevant terms, and equitable terms. And then on that QR code at the very bottom, we'll also have additional resources that will go through other literature that we are unable to talk about today. So today we're going to discuss 3 key papers.
Hey, thanks, Tanisha. So, once again, my name is Ryan Tucci. I'm faculty now at the University of Wisconsin. And we're going to talk about kind of 3 papers that highlight these 3 different themes that I think really nicely apply to the topic of today. So the first is really to think about how you can cultivate equity really across your institution. Second is to think about how you can do that specifically within the emergency medicine residency program that you have or help engage with. And the last thing, while it sounds simple, it's just so important and powerful, and I really love this paper that we're going to talk about, that really just highlights the importance of listening to your residents. So these slides are busy, and that's why you have your handout to look at them in a little bit more detail. So this is the first paper. This paper on faculty recruitment, it's actually a CORD consensus guideline that was created early this year by Davenport et al. In West Gem, and it was a group of folks at CORD that came up with this consensus guideline, really focused on best practices for faculty recruitment and retention, but really when you read it, if you put the word resident in for the word faculty, 90% of it applies. And so they did a PubMed search, they narrowed it down, and then they did expert kind of opinion and consensus on their topics. And there's a handful of figures that are really wonderful, and this is probably my favorite one that applies to today, where they go over a handful of best practices, and I'll just read the first 3, because again, I think you'll find that this applies to residents as well. So the first is to to establish a culture of inclusivity, about training on cultural competency and bias training. The second to be about avoiding overuse of underrepresented emergency medicine faculty for just administrative or mentoring positions, and making sure that those that are doing that are getting the appropriate kind of recognition and compensation for that. And the third is to have kind of these institutional structures with chief diversity officers, and then I would argue within the departments as well to have kind of key titled positions within emergency medicine at DEI work. So that's the first paper. Right, and the second paper is kind of an interesting thought process. This paper was actually just published by Michael et al. In the Academic Emergency Medicine Education and Training Special Edition this year, or last year, I guess. And it was really thinking about how can we use our existing ACG milestones and kind of these things that we already need to do to kind of get the curriculum, get residents through a curriculum and integrate DEI topics and really kind of assess residents on DEI issues. And so, again, a really busy small slide that I encourage you to look at the actual paper on. But on the left-hand side here, you have everything that residency program directors are extremely familiar with: patient care, systems-based practice, professionalism, interprofessional and communication skills. And it goes across the 5 milestones, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, and thinks about these different DEI topics and saying, where are our learners at, and how can we measure their progression across their time in training? And I think really thinking that this isn't just a role for a single individual within a resident, but really everyone's responsibility within the residency to help create that culture and to create that mindset where everyone feels included in the training program. And then Tanisha, I'll have you do the last one.
So the third paper really focuses on our third point, which is listen to your residents. We had a semi-structured, in-depth, qualitative analysis of interviews of Black, Latino, and Native American residents at SNMA in 2017. And these residents span across a total of 21 different residency programs. It was a very small sample size, about 27 residents, but it was just enough to get a main theme of what these diverse residents faced within their residency program. And from this analysis, we saw that each resident faced either a daily barrage of microaggressions, that there was basically a minority tax to be an ambassador, and the third was the challenge of kind of negotiating professional and personal identity within the space. Now, within each theme, there are specific examples in which these residents face daily microaggressions. So one of the first ones kind of shows alienation. Wow, you've really come a long way to go through what you've been through as a Mexican, as an Caribbean, right? As someone that isn't usually in this space. So that sense of belonging, or not belonging rather, was really felt throughout this theme of microaggressions from these diverse residents in that space. And there's the assumption that everyone in this space comes from a lower economic status, right? Wow, how did you make it so far without such and such resources, right? Or thinking that this person isn't a resident, isn't a physician, isn't a doctor. Hey, do you mind picking up this thing off the floor, right? Hi, I'm looking for my nurse, right? So these were very common themes in the daily microaggressions that residents face within their life of residency. And our second theme shows that they were tasked to being ambassadors for basically everyone that fit in that outsider, right, realm. They were tasked with possibly leading certain microaggression trainings, or sending out emails, or maybe talking to the other diverse residents, right? Because only diverse residents can talk to diverse residents, right? So these are the tasks that they were given because they were considered different in this space. And then the third theme was really being able to negotiate their personal identity, or not being seen as other. Oftentimes, because there's a small number of residents in this space, no matter how inclusive we try to be, people still feel very alienated. So this is why it's important to be very intentional about creating inclusive and equitable spaces so that this feeling of isolation is a little bit less. And examples of that really show that sometimes when in those feelings of isolation, residents came up with varying coping mechanisms. Whether or not they face a daily microaggression, maybe they would laugh it off, maybe they would just ignore it. They would carry on about their day. Sometimes they even feel the pressure to assimilate, right? Whether it be, you know what, I'm not gonna wear my afro out today, I'm gonna straighten my hair because it'll look more presentable, right? Less people will be looking at me as the outsider or as someone different in the room. So these are tiny things, but they affect the daily performance of residents. And these residents, of course, go on to be faculty members and community physicians that care for the same population that we ultimately care for. So today we've discussed a lot. We tried to break it down into 3 main papers that really covered all these themes. So to cultivate a culture embedded in equity, right? That's our common goal. 2 is to be intentional. Intentionally incorporate DEI into the curriculum, into education, so that everyone can learn, right? And then 3, arguably the most important, not because I'm a resident, but listen to your residents, right? And I think it's important to have a team perspective because residents are still learning, and having that perspective as program directors, as faculty, you know what your residents need, but also your residents know what they need in order to thrive as well. So thank you guys so much. I think this is a perfect segue in how we can all learn how to be allies for our residents and learn a little bit more from Jessica and Adam. Thank you.
Hey everybody, glad to see some familiar faces out there. My name is Adam McFarland. I'm a medical education fellow at the University of Chicago.
Yeah, and I'm Jessica Feist. I introduced myself earlier, but I'm a National Clinician Scholars Program Fellow at UCLA right now.
And so we're going to spend about half an hour talking about the concept of allyship, which is an incredibly important topic as we've seen so far this morning. By nature of being in this room, I think all of us are sort of interested in this idea of allyship and sort of how can we take this back to our residency programs and support our residents. And sort of by nature of being involved in residence, allyship is not something that's sort of optional, right? Like it's a requirement for you as people that are training and molding and helping develop the young people that are going to go on and be future physicians. So an incredibly important concept to understand and sort of develop and practice in your life. The sort of roadmap, we're going to talk about sort of what allyship is, kind of discuss the idea of performative allyship, provide some sort of directions and conceptual framework, and then actually have a little bit of a discussion and sort of fight back against the noise from the room behind us. So, okay, so what is allyship? So it's an active, consistent, and arduous practice of unlearning and reevaluating in which a person in a position of privilege and power seeks to operate in solidarity with a marginalized group. That's a definition taken from the Anti-Oppression Network. And what I want to really highlight there is that active, consistent, and arduous are the words that I've bolded. Allyship can be difficult. It's a long process, it's a journey, and it's something that takes consistently an active engagement. It's not an identity. Like I said, it's a lifelong process of building relationships. It's not self-defined. It's not enough to say, oh, I'm a queer ally. I'm going to go to Pride and sort of wave my flag, right? So it's something that needs to be required by uplifting and supporting the people that we seek to ally ourselves with. And allyship is a verb, not a noun, meaning it's an active, ongoing process that you have to work to demonstrate and exemplify rather than claim to be.
Yeah, so over the past couple of years, we've seen a lot of pressure, justifiably, to call out racism and make sure that we're on the right side of things. So we felt that it was really important in this talk today to discuss performative allyship as well. So allyship is not always, it can be harmful at times. And when you are in a situation where you have, when you have the opportunity to step up and don't do so, that is kind of consistent with being a performative allyship. So this can really range from things that are more subtle, like not like putting something on your profile and not actually like speaking out when it really counts, or it can be a little bit more profound, performing research without involving communities, and things like that. So we'll go into some details. So these are some components of what performative allyship looks like. So superficial engagement, kind of like what I mentioned, putting something on your profile, something that or like a marketing campaign without actually investing in systemic change. Focusing on external factors. So saying something like, this is the problem caused by Republicans, and not really focusing on what you can do yourself to combat racism. Staying quiet is a little self-explanatory, but if you are in the boardroom and someone says something that is a microaggression and you don't actually speak out, that is an example of being a performative ally, despite doing all those other things. And then lastly, expecting recognition or profiting, so participating in committees, but really focusing on receiving recognition for this. So essentially, being a performative ally ends up perpetuating the racist systems that you are allegedly trying to speak out against, and we really wanted to highlight that today.
Yeah, and I think an important point to bring out is that you can be a true ally or a performative ally to different groups or the same group at different moments in time, right? Just like we're saying allyship is a dynamic process, right? It's something that you have to look at and address over and over, and you have this danger of sort of falling back into those systems of being a performative ally despite the work that you're doing.
Yeah.
So how do we be a better ally? How do we sort of develop, grow, and develop our practice and better support our residents? So this was a conceptual framework specifically for developing anti-racist medical educators that was published in Academic Medicine in January of 2022. I really like this model. It's more specific to anti-racism, but I think it applies to a lot of different marginalized groups in medicine. And so the way that they sort of developed this conceptual framework is sort of a pyramid-based layer of how to develop and grow in your allyship, and particularly for faculty development. So you see that the base of this pyramid says foundational awareness. So those are things like understanding your implicit biases, understanding the role that microaggressions play in your work, and sort of developing that self-awareness of how am I being oppressive, how am I being a passive ally for yourself. And then sort of taking the next step up in the pyramid and going to foundational knowledge. So understanding the racist structures that have perpetuated health disparities in our country. The sort of work that we were doing this morning about identifying what underrepresented residents need or want in their residency program. And then going the next two steps farther by actually developing policy and trying to make changes that are going to dismantle these oppressive structures for any sort of marginalized group in medicine. My personal opinion is that even though this is a pyramid where sort of the ending goal is to be this anti-racist medical educator, I think this is more of a cycle. There's sort of different, like I sort of talk about with active and performative allyship, right? There's different ways in your career that you're going to be in different areas on this pyramid and ways that you go back and forth, right? So this is an active process. That's definitely the destination at the top, but there's definitely different levels that this applies to you in your practice. So what we wanted to do was talk a little bit about some actual strategies that we sort of identified based on using our conceptual framework for sort of like more specific ways that you could be allies for residents.
Yeah, we are going to try to break up into little groups because we do have a few cases, because we really want to have people hash out, what they think about these cases and how it applies to their institutions. But to set up a little bit of a framework for potential strategies for allyship. So one, self-examination and critical analysis. So really looking at yourself, your privilege, where your positionality is, and seeing how that might factor into how you move forward and how you are an ally. Identify and call out racism and discrimination by name, and also kind of in line with not staying quiet and really doing that in spaces where it counts. And then educating residents and faculty. I think we all know that not everyone is as up to date maybe on like DI literature and whatnot, but really trying to make sure and bring other people up and into the conversation so that allyship and your efforts are productive.
Providing space and uplifting voices. So, particularly in this political climate, we have a lot of stuff going on that's going to affect a lot of groups of people, right? Regardless of whether those policies are actually enacted. Are you providing the space to talk about those things? Are you providing the space in your programs to uplift underrepresented groups to sort of be engaged in scholarship or be engaged in advocacy within their program? Or are those sort of structures that you have in place to keep those people down? Establishing mentorship, Dr. Pope talked about this earlier today with his mentorship project, right? So are you connecting people from underrepresented backgrounds to other people in your residency program to sort of help uplift and make those connections that they need? Connecting to mental health resources. So is your strategy to provide just sort of a list of mental health resources, or sort of have cultural specific ways that you can connect to people and help uplift them in a way that a particular mental health professional might not be able to? And then lastly, using your privilege and advocate, so sort of going those higher two levels on the conceptual framework that we discussed before. How are you taking your allyship and your sort of work in the field to dismantling the oppressive structures that could be negatively affecting your residents? So this is the part where we try to get more active. Oops, sorry, I just hit the microphone. So what we have is, do you want to pass this out? Yeah. So we sort of developed four very short sort of scenarios, and so what we'd like to do is have a moment to discuss in small groups. These scenarios aren't inherently good, they're not inherently bad, but what we want to do is sort of focus this conversation of allyship in active versus performative allyship, but also sort of thinking about your own residency program to try to think about ways that you might be engaging in certain practices or things that you can change to make it a more inclusive environment for your residents. So there's 4 cases on there. Again, we wanted to do this in small groups and really facilitate discussion. Our thought was sort of discuss all 4 of them if you'd like, discuss one of them if you want, but essentially sort of, again, think about ways that this could represent true allyship, performative allyship, and then we'll sort of come back toward the end and just sort of share whatever thoughts that we have. So we were thinking about 10 minutes, so maybe around 8:50, 8:52, unless people get done early. Anybody have any questions? Do we need more? I made 25 copies, hopefully that's enough.
Any particular breakout?
I think whoever you want to be with. Yeah. so we have
I actually had this as a residency, and I have to say, and it was a tour of Lake Michigan, and what was special about it was that it was led by a community, it was a community-based business, and they had great leaders who were in areas that had come out, and it was not a giant bus, it was just we were done it now.
We'll regroup in like a minute or two.
All right, wrap up your last comments if you can, please. Did you want to go case by case or just Okay. Sure. Okay.
Okay, so for the most part, it sounds like people got through a couple of cases. So we'll just see, and feel free to just talk about maybe what your group discussed, how things might have demonstrated performative allyship, what might have been good in this scenario, and then we can see what came out of it. I think that groups did different cases, so that worked out pretty well. So case one, anyone have?
Also, real quick, if you could all maybe have one person in your group collect the papers, and I'll just pick them up at the end so I can recycle them. Well, or if you want to keep them, I don't care. That's fine. But I just don't want to leave them in the room and litter.
Yeah.
I have a unique perspective on this because I talk about nothing being all the way good and all the way bad, but this experience in residency for me was very poignant and really improved my ability to understand that community. So one of our sites in Michigan is Implicit, and when I started residencies at the tail end of the water crisis where they're giving out all of these water bottles. And what was different about that program was that it was led by a community member, and it was a community member's business who would take people and do like a bigger van size tour of Flint. She did things like talk about what food desert looked like and drove us from one side of a liquor store that was like a grocery store to them to the next these long. And then there was also distances between bus stops to show like when you give your patients return precautions and don't just come back and things get worse. This is how far they have to travel to get to the bus to come to the emergency department. And because it was community led, she took us to different areas in Flint that I would have never seen on my own, and helped really overcome some of the bias in the community that some of the residents have. Like some people say, oh, when you're coming home at night at Flint, don't even stop at red lights, go straight to the freeway. And so there's this idea of being frightened in the community, and so this was a different way of understanding and seeing the people live in the community, seeing their water bottles stacked up. And so I feel like in some ways it wasn't performative because it was run by a community member and it was like really showing some of the elements of different ways that they experience their own disparities in ways that I had never laid eyes on in other people. And you're like, I know my community, but I just haven't seen my community.
Yeah. Anyone else? Seems like a pro was the fact that this was done in the first place, and maybe con or area of improvement is that they could have involved community members more.
Yeah. And just to reiterate, we're not saying these are like bad scenarios, right? It's sort of like shades of gray and sort of like,
Yeah.
different aspects of allyship. So.
I feel like I also, my program also does this, but my
Totally. And I think in one of the scenarios too, we kind of call out faculty members a little bit. Yes. Yeah.
I think for something like this, we also have to be very careful and very mindful of how this might impact a resident who identifies with people in this environment. If they hear their colleagues say things that are that are demonstrating implicit bias, thoughts of racism, microaggressions, and to make sure that you have a debriefing process that's available for those residents afterward, so you can help them process their feelings about it, but then also, in turn, there also should be a response, like an organized response for those individuals who may have said the wrong thing to help educate them.
Yeah, the debriefing is definitely a good point. When we did this at Boston Medical Center, we had designated space to talk about it afterwards, which I think speaks to your point.
Just a follow-up on the comments. Words matter, right? And you start realizing this even after doing this for many years. When the George Floyd incident happened, WhatsApp, the residents had WhatsApp. Communicating, some of the residents showed up late for shift, and one of the residents said, "Oh, it's because of the demonstration." And the resident said it as a matter of fact, but it really impacted some of our learners, our residents, because they felt that demonstration was an inappropriate word for what was happening. With those, it's a great point. Thank you for saying that, because you don't even realize some of the words that we use are so impactful. And some of the faculty heard that and didn't realize, and they said, "Well, but it was. What's the big deal?" I'm like, "Well, it's not your space to tell you. Tell me or somebody else whether it's a big deal or it's a big deal for them."
Totally. And I think that's why we felt that it was important to share that this was kind of a space to be kind of vulnerable with, some of the verbiage, especially what Rose was saying in the beginning, even, the gendered language story really resonated because unfortunately, regardless of intentionality, sometimes performative allyship is performative allyship, but I think no one's going to grow unless we have these conversations like around that.
We have like 4 minutes to ask like general comments on those are the cases versus each one.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, we have we only have a few minutes left. Did anyone have really strong feelings for any of the other cases? We can keep going through.
If not, that's fine. No big deal.
We had a good conversation about this one. It was on a couple of different levels. Number one is, are we creating an environment for these resident students, which is implicit? So are we checking a box by creating this SAEM scholarship, or are we actually creating an inclusive space? And the fact that they're not matching them means that maybe we're not creating an inclusive space. And the other side of that is, are we as programs not ranking these people appropriately?
Yes.
Yeah, I think that's an incredibly important point to bring up because you're right. There's been so much sort of like vocal and sort of like online dissemination about these like visiting URM scholarships, right? It's what are you doing at your programs to sort of support those people, but are you guys engaging in practices during the rank list meeting that is highly focused on standardized testing and is not sort of comprehensive application review that could be preventing those people from matching?
Yeah. Or even funding doesn't stop at allowing those students to come, but really funding activities to create fellowship and a good experience for them. I think like we've kind of seen that program grow during our residency too.
Great.
This was the one that was speaking a little bit more to faculty. I don't know if anyone shared pearls on how to get them more involved.
I think it's a question we were just about to explore. It's a really great question. How do you prevent an environment that focuses on checking the boxes? And how do you sort of get faculty buy-in? We should have more time to kind of talk about that. But it happens. I don't care what faculty say in public, but privately, I think we all realize that it's become a checkbox. It's become something that says, okay, complete your CV, your training, complete your microaggression
and we talk about being quiet, like residents do notice that and do see when, okay, you're like very quick to do this implicit bias thing, but then when you're shoulder to shoulder with someone who's being, racist, whatever it may be, it is difficult. So, all right.
Yeah, we can probably. Yeah, so just sort of wrapping up because we're out of time here. So just want to end with the idea that, like we mentioned before, allyship's a never-ending journey. It's moving forward, it's moving backwards, and you can be at different stages in your journey depending on which group you're talking about and sort of where you are in your career. So really, really encouraged by the discussions today. Here are our sources. If anybody wants a specific citation for that conceptual framework, please just email me or talk to me afterward and I'll give it to you. But thanks everybody and thanks for your participation.
Yeah. I think this is the perfect segue from performative allyship to community engagement with Jeremy and Sam.
If you don't want your paper,
All right. Good morning, everyone. I'll get some of those papers back. Give you guys a second. Actually, if you guys do want to take a quick stand, stretch, and then sit back down so that we're a little bit more into it.
It's a marathon today.
All right. So, good morning, everyone. I'm Jeremy Collado. I was a former chief resident at Denver Health, and I'm a first-year faculty at Mayo Clinic, Florida. And I'm here with...
I'm Sandra Coker. I'm a second-year resident, incoming third year at the University of Chicago. I'm also the resident director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. I'm also currently the EMRA chair of Diversity and Inclusion Committee, along with Tanisha, who is my vice chair, or chair-elect, rather. So happy to be here.
So as you've noticed, quite a few of us have held these multiple roles, and moving into residency, moving out of residency, and sort of moving along those lines. And I think the first case was a really good example of community engagement and what we could potentially do. Just as a quick show of hands, how many programs have any community engagement requirements, or at least a highly developed community engagement program? So maybe a couple. So I think this is really important. It's something to think about because many residents go into these programs with these ideas. I'm sure you've interviewed many residents or spoken to or future residents, rather, that have said, I'm really interested in doing this. I'm really interested in doing street medicine. I'm really interested in working with the LGBTQ community. I'm really interested in doing these things. They get into residency and they're bogged down by everything that is residency and don't have the space to be able to jump into. So what you end up seeing is a lot of residents that are experiencing minority tax to try to build these programs and aren't able to get them off the ground because they don't have that support from above. So Sandra and I are going to speak a little bit more about maybe how to get those underway and possibly different ways that we can get there.
All right. Okay. So, what is community engagement? Community engagement simply is being involved with the community you serve. A lot of our big academic programs, our ED, is in a community that is historically marginalized, historically just ridden with healthcare disparities and inequities. So being involved in your community is important. I think we can all agree on that. Why is it our problem? Why does it matter in the emergency department? Why should it matter to our residents? Why should it matter to our faculty and everybody else that's involved in our involved in their clinical training and development during that time in the emergency department? Well, we think that it matters because the most important parts of residency, the purpose of residency, is to develop a strong clinician. We know that that's your priority. Residents go to residency to be a stronger doctor at the end of the day, and that's what's most important. We all agree on that. But also we need to be compassionate physicians. We need to be empathetic physicians. We need to be more patient-centered. We also need to be community-focused as well. Learning about the community that you serve helps you to be a more empathetic physician and clinician. Learning about the community you serve helps you to better understand why your patients continue to come back to the emergency department and why, labeling our patients with terms like frequent flyers and all those, terms, why it matters and why it's negative and why it's doing more harm than good. So our stance on community engagement is that it is imperative for emergency medicine residency programs. And we understand, as Jeremy said, there is a lot of time asked and a lot of things asked of residents, especially interns, going through your training. That kind of, even if you go, and I was definitely one of those residents, started residency, most of my interview was about how I wanted to get my hands dirty and my feet wet and be involved in community engagement work. That's my passion. That's why I do what I do. I found intern year, I had no space. I couldn't even breathe, right? Dreaming was hard. So if we embed community engagement as a requirement, as part of our curriculum, as a mandatory part of our training, then we build space, we create space and opportunity for these people who come to these programs to do these amazing things and have potential to do amazing things, to actually, flex their muscles in those areas as well, to learn more about that, to also, on the back end, be more well and feel better about themselves, about what they're doing, about their time in residency, and improve their overall satisfaction and happiness because they feel like they're doing something that matters more than just being in a hospital setting. We've talked about what community engagement is, we've talked about the importance of community engagement, and we've said that our take, if you want to share anything else, is that community engagement is important. Another thing that I will add is during your time as a resident, and as you are struggling to actualize all the things you talked about during your interview, it's really discouraging to realize that, frankly, time is not there. And when you're at a program who does not make time for you, or does not make time for community engagement, does not make time for any sort of volunteer work or any sort of activities, structured into the curriculum outside of the hospital, it becomes very hard and kind of, it definitely takes a toll on your wellness, especially if you're somebody who, is doing emergency medicine, wants to be on the front lines for those specific reasons, which a lot of us do. How can programs support this? How can programs make sure that this is not the case? How can we start implementing more community engagement into our programs? How can we change those two hands that went up when we asked that initial question, if you guys have community engagement in your program, how can we make that more and have everybody in the room raise their hand? We need time. We need time built into our schedules as residents. We need also funding. We spoke about funding. Sounds like UPenn is doing an amazing job. We all saw that. As a resident trying to work hard for my residency program to get some of the residents that were amazing that UPenn got, we saw the work you guys put in. We saw the money you put in behind everything you said, right? So if you're talking, again, performative, if we're talking on Twitter, Twitter is going crazy now, during recruitment season about all these things that we have at our programs, all these things we want to do, all these amazing residents that we have, where's the money that we're using to fund them, to fund their ideas, to fund their projects? Where's the time that we're blocking off and protecting their schedule to allow them to engage in their community? And how are we getting more than just the minority residents involved in these community engagement activities? We already mentioned the minority tax. I won't go into that. We all know what a minority tax is. Another stance that we have is that it's important for not only the underrepresented minority residents to be involved in these engagement opportunities, but it's imperative that our allies, our program directors, our other faculty are also involved, and this is made mandatory. Mandatory is a unfortunate word, but this is also important and stressed for them as well. We need to do this together and as a unit, because it's not only important for our residents, it's not only important for our Black residents, it's not only important for our LGBTQ residents, it's important for everyone, including our allies and people who do not identify as any of those topics or any of those labels, I would say. So let's continue.
So I think moving on, we're going to look at a few of these examples, some things that some other programs have done, chat about them a little bit, and then we'll have an activity after of maybe where we can start. We realize that a lot of this is getting buy-in from the top down, but what sort of things can we do that don't necessarily cost much, whether it's time or money, and to be able to get residents somewhere to start. You're never, at least in my experience, it's very hard to get buy-down from the top down if you're not showing something. You have to have some kind of document showing, well, this worked well in some way, shape, or form, have some kind of pilot. So we'll chat a little bit more about different educational events, pipeline programs, food pantries, that sort of thing, that we can possibly start building from, and then we'll do that activity next.
So these are just a few examples of things that a few of us have already going at our programs. The case one that you guys had earlier about the bus tour that interns go on, that was one of the first community engagement projects that we had when I started residency at my program as an intern during orientation week, and that impacted me in a crazy way. I forgot who made that comment, but that was an amazing experience for me. That's one example of, something that doesn't cost much. It's also built into orientation week, so we're not like taking out a clinical time or whatever, but I do want to see more people involved in that. And then an important part of that is that it was led by a attending physician who was also a grad of our medical school and our residency program, and also a local Southside community member. He grew up there since diapers and still lives in that community. So that made the experience all the more, important, and definitely shaped my experience starting intern year. But here are another a list of other examples of community engagement and examples that you guys are free to build on and discuss in your small groups and also take back to your programs. So Jeremy's going to discuss our activity.
So this should be a relatively simple activity, but maybe just building on some of those ideas. So things like food pantries that we mentioned the last, street medicine, free clinics. A very simple one that we had done in Denver is so we have a conference every week, and every program does. But on those weeks or on those months that you have an additional week of conference, maybe using that day to do a specific program, whether that is stop the bleed and teaching people in the community simple things about how to put pressure, hands-free CPR, things along those lines. Something that some programs are doing also is many programs have, I guess, that buddy system between each of the years. So you have a sibling or whatever it is that you're calling it, and then within those, quote, families, having each family make up a program that they're sort of required to do on a weekend that they can get together to be able to do something for the community and be able to see those things. So in small groups, maybe teams, however you want to pair up, let's look at some activities that we could potentially do to bring back to your program. So things that we want to look at is who's going to be involved. Is it going to be just the interested residents? Should it be all residents? Should faculty be involved? Should they not? And I'm saying this as in, yes, in ideal scenario, everybody's involved, but we realize that this is not going to happen overnight. So we have to start somewhere and be able to build from there. What type of activity it is, we mentioned a couple on the last page. And then when? Is it going to be on that fifth week of the month? Is it going to be specific dates? Are residents going to have to do it during their free time? That last one I'd probably recommend against, simply because we all know that residents feel overwhelmed as it is, and if they feel like there's something else that they have to check off, they're probably not going to do it, but we have to start somewhere. So maybe we can get in some small groups, and if you have, we'll be walking around. If you have any ideas or questions that you'd like to ask us, we're more than willing to help, but our idea is for you to bring at least one thing back to your program to say, this is something we thought about, this is something we could potentially do, and see if we can get buy-in from the top down.